I'm here. Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Hale, for introducing me. Thank you for moderating this event, and thank you, all of you, for showing interest in this project. I'm, alongside being the Dean of the School of International Relations at MGIMO and the Vice President for Research, I'm also the publisher and editor-in-chief of the International Trends. International Trends is called in Russian Международные процессы, and I'm hopeful, humbly, that those of you who've been studying Russia are aware of the existence of this journal, or maybe have been following the articles published in it in Russian over the years. We consider ourselves to be a theoretical journal, first and foremost, and the original mandate and the mission that we formulated for ourselves was to bring close to the theoretical perspectives that exist out there in the West and in the non-Western parts of the international system, closer together in terms of the mutual understanding of what theoretical frameworks we as analysts and students of international affairs use to make sense of the world. As regards this particular project, I think it is the consequence of two parallel stories. One of them is our story of cooperation with the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs of the Georgia Tech Institute. And that cooperation resulted in a particular course and then a research program of studying statecraft. This course ran 2 years. It was very successful, involving students from various universities. And in parallel, there was this drive from the community, I would say, from the university community here at MGIMO, from our leadership, to internationalize the international trends, so to make it more accessible in terms of its readership, its appeal to those who are interested in the Russian view of international relations from the scholarly perspective. And one of the tools that was proposed to us was exactly the tool of special issues done in 2 languages, in Russian and in English, with the invitation of guest editors to show the commonality of research agenda and the commonality of topics that we are both keen to research. And that's how we decided to sort of make the international trends serve the interests of this collaborative project between MGIMO and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. So basically, that's the origin of the project. And even though I'm the editor of the journal as such, for this one, we decided to turn it over almost entirely to our guest editors, to Dr. Troitskiy, to our colleagues from Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, to its chair, Adam Stulberg, and to Jenna Jordan, to do the editing work in terms of the selection of the authors, of helping them make the right angle of sort of tackling the issue in such a way that the contributions to the issue could be complementary, so that they could tell a coherent story of what statecraft is in this new theoretical understanding that we were trying to propose, thinking that it could be both a theoretical and a practical contribution. By theoretical application of this, I'm referring obviously to how this concept could be used and applied to understanding the dynamic and the logic behind the current Russian-American relations. And I must say now that with hindsight, that the choice of statecraft as the topic for the special issue and for the collaborative project more generally was quite pertinent for a number of reasons. First of all, as we all know, the pandemic revealed that the national governments became, again, during these times, the actors of first resort, as very often is the case in times of crisis. And they self-structured in an informal hierarchy among themselves, in accordance with their ability to respond internally and internationally to this healthcare crisis. Secondly, a state's ability to get one's house in order, meaning to curb the progression of the illness, to develop a vaccine, to convince the populations to get vaccinated, all testify to the quality of their inward-looking statecraft, but also their ability to promote their best practices on the world stage, diffuse the norms of how to best handle the pandemic, how to use other tools that are available to states to combat COVID as a platform to promote international cooperation and to help overcome political issues by showing that more practical interaction is now in demand and in order, shows the quality of their outward-looking statecraft. I must say that also sort of in parallel to our attempts and efforts to look from the theoretical and practical perspectives at the issue of statecraft, we could see that this issue, maybe due to the reasons mentioned just now, the interest in other international academic journals to this in this concept has also been on the rise, and from authors like Princeton examining the place of statecraft in the theoretical debate on the unit versus system levels of analysis, to the analysis of economic statecraft tools with other works in Russia's response to the 2014 sanctions, as well as new visions of digital statecraft. All this shows that this year, I hope with the contribution of our special issue, has brought the theme of statecraft to the fore. And thus I thank, of course, the guest editors and the principal investigators of this collaborative project for their involvement, for their active contribution to the journal. And I hope that this will also mark a new stage in its development as an instrument and a platform of international scholarly communication. Thank you very much again, Dr. Hale, for moderating this discussion.
Hey, thank you very much. So now we'll hear from the three guest editors. First, that will be Jenna Jordan.
All right, thank you so much. And I apologize if there's a little noise in the background. There's construction going on right outside my window, so I apologize in advance. But I want to thank you all for attending today. And before I begin, I also want to thank the US-Russia Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation for their support in this project. And it's really been a pleasure to be a part of this project and really this very creative group of scholars who are engaging deeply in these issues of statecraft from really very different and interesting approaches. And I see these dialogues as really critical to developing a way to understand how the discourse surrounding great power competition can illuminate and highlight differences and similarities in how states conduct foreign policy and the specific choices that they make. And I think doing so can really allow us to develop an analysis of how the US and Russia view their own strategic environment, view that of others, and the choices that they make within the context of great power politics. So I'm going to say a few words about the concept of statecraft itself, and then I want to conclude with a few observations regarding US and Russian approaches towards statecraft within the context of discourse. In 1952, Morton Kaplan defined statecraft, really underscoring its importance to the stability of the international system, really. And he said, quote, "It includes the construction of strategies for securing the national interest in the international arena, as well as the execution of these strategies by diplomats. In a day when the world is becoming divided between two great power blocs, when neutrality is becoming increasingly more difficult to maintain, when statecraft is invading the economic and cultural aspects of social existence, as well as the political and military, when most great problems of domestic life must be reconsidered with regard to their bearing on the international system, few, if any, can doubt its importance. The successful or unsuccessful conduct of statecraft may settle the fate of our way of life, and giving the possibilities of modern war, it may in a deeper sense settle the question of whether any type of civilized life, ours or the Soviets, can survive." Now, statecraft is an often misused concept in the study of international relations, and it's often defined so broadly that it can become almost meaningless as a concept for understanding great power politics. The more classic definitions tend to focus on statecraft as the art of conducting state affairs, and often reference a range of the different kinds of policies across both foreign and domestic dimensions. And these can include things like a state's policymaking process or the selection of specific means to achieve policy goals. And this broad definition tends to conflate power with techniques of policy. Now, at the other extreme are definitions that are sort of have much more specific articulations that focus on specific foreign policy objectives, the formation of a particular strategy, the use of specific instruments that we look at, many of these in the special issue, things like economic sanctions, tools of financial statecraft, coercive diplomacy, cyber operations, diplomatic pressure, security assistance, energy supply disruptions, instrumental diffusion of religious beliefs or information, right? All of things that are attempts to get rivals to do what states want them to do. Now, at its base, a meaningful definition would include the ends, means, and ways embraced by a government in its efforts to coerce or to influence behavior, right, deter or compel, a state short of resorting to the use of brute military force. And so this understanding focuses on the techniques, logics, and goals adopted by a state and the conditions that affect the scopes, domains, costs, and weight of foreign influence strategies. So it's more than just a formulation of foreign policy, which is often conflated with statecraft. Statecraft as a concept should capture the underlying rationale for the choice of specific instruments, which allows us to focus our attention to the different ways that actors try to influence others. Now, in our article, well, actually, I wanted to say briefly that the conditions of statecraft, the practice of it today are different than they were in the Cold War. And I think this also highlights a very important temporal dimension to the concept. So we can see lots of differences between the Cold War and post-Cold War era in the practice of statecraft. For example, now we often see asymmetries rather than parity as describing the strategic context and long-term competition. There's also new instruments that we see available to states in the post-Cold War era, right? We see the emergence of new technologies, demonstrated in the use of conventional military operations or information operations, gray zone conflicts, the use of instruments across domains. So it's a more complicated landscape. Now, in our article, that introduces the issue, we focus on how contemporary discourse can highlight important trends, differences, and similarities in the US and Russian approaches to statecraft. And we do this by examining data from GDELT, which is a global database of language, events, and tones, through the CAMEO, which is a conflict in media events observations, a coding framework which can automate the extraction of events data from international and multilingual news and media sources, and they can be analyzed in terms of discourse to characterize events based on verbs and phrases that are associated with concepts such as the frequency or intensity of conflict cross-domain, geographic dimensions of assertiveness. And so this data is really capturing and can capture divergence and convergence in the descriptions of US and Russia postures since 2013. Now, I want to highlight that assertiveness doesn't always mean conflict. It can be both cooperative or conflictual in nature. And I know I'm almost out of time, but I just want to end by saying we can talk more about the data and the discussion if people are interested. But I just want to highlight two differences between US and Russian assertive postures that come out of this data. And so the two powers often diverge in the domains in which states are operating, but also in the areas that they focus on, the geographic areas of activity. Now, US international assertiveness has often been characterized by Western sources as very much relying on diplomacy and economic tools, to a lesser extent military tools, while Russia's also invested in assertive diplomacy. Since 2014, it's sort of been characterized more as using military as an instrument of statecraft, relying less on economic sanctions or inducements. However, economic tools are gaining prominence among this Russian strategic community as the discourse on US strategy is reviving the salience of legal instruments and others. And so these patterns don't reflect postures in specific cases or speak to causal dynamics, nor do they really reflect the prevailing preferences and different dimensions of statecraft. But they raise important questions about the risks of escalation and success and the conditions under which states select different policy instruments to advance international influence. So I just kind of wanted to give you a flavor of some of the work that we did, thinking about how we can apply this concept within this framework of discourse and understanding different strategic postures. So thank you. Sorry, I went a little bit over, a minute 20 over.
Perfect, thank you very much. So next up will be Mikhail Troitskiy of MGIMO.
Thank you very much, Henry. Glad to be here, and thank you all for coming to this workshop. So I thought to follow up on what Jenna just told us regarding our definition of statecraft, our working definition. I thought we could talk a little bit about illustrations of the concept of statecraft and of its usefulness. And to do that, we highlight some of the dilemmas that policymakers actually face when they select appropriate means of statecraft. So one fairly obvious statecraft dilemma that we discuss in the issue is whether and how you define the interests behind your policies. So any attempt to define interests publicly and in a clear-cut way would require making a difficult choice because interests are often exclusive and your resources are limited and lobbies and pressure groups never go to sleep. So do you go ahead and define your interests or you try to keep your hands free to change your ways and means as necessary? Can you run a foreign policy based on ambiguity in defining your interests and preferred means of statecraft, or you actually cannot? And it looks as if both Russia and the United States have been long facing this kind of dilemma, given, for example, the recently reported discussion between Presidents Biden and Putin about democracy. Okay, so there's certainly a strong case to be made in favor, or let's say there's a case to be made against full disclosure of your preferred means of statecraft because of the difficulty of reaching consensus within your society in a democracy, right? But there's the question, of course, whether in an electoral system a leader can remain popular without openly declaring interests and goals and means of statecraft and then achieving those goals by the declared methods. So relying too much on ambiguity may not get you too far in such a system. And this is the first dilemma, the first statecraft dilemma. Now, secondly, and somewhat related to this, is a second illustrative dilemma, which has to do with the leveraging of identity for statecraft purposes. And identity politics, of course, is so widespread these days because identity can be used as a source of commitment, both domestically and internationally. And it goes to the heart of our discussion of statecraft in this special issue. So you convey resolve to achieve your foreign policy goals by just referring to your identity, by citing your identity that supposedly limits your freedom of action, right? So you commit yourself to a certain strategy of conflict or cooperation, and it sometimes works. Others would just back off because they cannot find a credible source of conveying resolve on a similar scale. And of course, examples of commitment from identity include protecting your ethnic kin or promoting democracy. But the problem with such identity statecraft is, of course, that you have to forswear many attractive policy options just because they contradict your declared identity. So identity statecraft, we believe, may work well for offensive purposes, but it may backfire particularly badly when you have to be on the defensive, because defense usually requires so much flexibility and ingenuity. For example, you may need allies to help defend from threats, but your identity may strongly limit your alliance choices so that you end up unprotected at a critical moment. And as another takeaway, it is very important to get a feeling of that moment when you have to turn to a defensive posture after your push has run out of steam. And finally, there's what we call statecraft scare. And it comes from a third dilemma, which is whether you weaponize or not weaponize a new technology, a new domain, or a particular technique of statecraft. So you may have, for example, detected a vulnerability in your opponent's defenses, and you have to decide whether you should really go ahead and exploit it. Whether and how much we necessarily weaponize artificial intelligence or outer space, and how much of our new capability should we actually make public, which is the known conceal versus reveal dilemma. So the problem here is that the mere existence of a new domain or technique of statecraft may result in increased tensions if one side feels that it's just falling behind in leveraging that domain or instrument for coercion, for the purposes of coercion. So the side that feels that is losing out because it falls behind on some innovative means of statecraft, such as, for example, highly calibrated sanctions, that side may respond asymmetrically and unexpectedly. And that has always been a risk in US-Russia relations, as Adam, I believe, will be able now to provide a good analysis of that phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So yes, next up will be Adam Stulberg of Georgia Tech.
Great. Well, thank you, Henry. Thank you to our partners in Russia and all the collaborators on this project. And let me take this opportunity to kind of pivot from my role as one of the co-editors to an author of one of the chapters, or a co-author with a doctoral student here at the Nunn School, Jonathan Darcy. And what we did was wanted to look at this and explicate this sanctions tangle dimension to the US-Russian relationship, or the Western Russian relationship. And that's been marked by a disconnect between the rising frequency and intensity of mutual sanctions and the limited evidence of explicit success with those sanctions, and a mutual complacency about this disconnect. And the mutual sensibility that these are low cost, low risk instruments of statecraft that can be calibrated and insulated from any kind of negative externalities to other dimensions of the relationship, such as strategic stability or arms control or nonproliferation or even climate change negotiations. And using a combination of sort of qualitative analysis of authoritative documents, applying machine learning to a larger corpus of Russian periodicals, as well as meshing unstructured data such as events data and text mining of Interfax data, we found that this sanctions tangle and this perverse kind of relationship is less a function of the absence of refined sanctions or the need to further demonstrate resolve and credibility as part of a threat-based thing, or even a function of sanctions being a product of domestic politics, sort of deadlock of our very different domestic discourses, but rather has to do with a very fundamental disconnect in our strategies about sanctions and where sanctions fall within our concept of competition and warfare. And so the findings of our articles suggest that there's a disconnect in worldviews about sanctions, not only about the legitimacy, but about the strategy. From the Russian perspective, they fall within this blurred distinctions of between peace and war. They constitute more of an instrument rather than an alternative of a broader definition of war. There's a very different logic of strategy that's less linear, less predicated on demonstrating credibility and explicit lines. In addition, the postures are disconnected because, as Mikhail mentioned, there's not only asymmetries, but also an increasing focus on non-reciprocity in responses to sanctions. In other words, not even planed or even focusing on blunting of sanctions, but a cross-domain orthogonal response, whereby the increasing frequency and intensity of Western sanctions is leading to an increasing frequency and intensity of Russia's broader coercive posture, not just confined to sanctions. And I think together, all of these things pose real challenges for thinking about sanctions as low cost, low risk, about maintaining a calibrated approach to sanctions, and can really spell some problems for strategic stability, since they're predicated on these different worldviews that really do not have moorings and common understandings of what is both acceptable in the sanctions space and what are the restraints, acceptable, sort of off, areas that are off limits that can lead to, blundering into a vertical escalation context. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So I would like to turn it over to some of the other authors to share their findings.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to discussions from some of the other authors. We had hoped originally to have Anne Vigneault here, who is associate professor at MGIMO, but she can't make it. But Andrey Baykov, the publisher of the journal, has kindly agreed to step in and summarize the contributions from her article. So let's turn back to Andrey before moving on to the others.
Yes, thank you, Henry. Here I am again. Right, so I was involved in this project at another stage, I mean, in the language and statecraft dynamic. So it's easier for me maybe than for other authors to summarize the main findings of this research. It's a pretty applied exercise in understanding what specific instruments can be used to enhance the effectiveness of foreign policy goals. And language is obviously one of those instruments. Language has for a long time been considered and remains to be considered as an effective tool of promoting a good image, a positive reputation, and therefore a tool of statecraft whereby you attempt and change other states' behavior by nonviolent means. And it's been used not just by those who have time and money to invest in promoting their good image, but also in other ways. And therefore the article traces back how the way language has been used as a tool of statecraft over time, how it's changed over time significantly with the spread of what constitutes globalization and the liberal script. Whether historically forcibly diffusing a language in states' colonies was a successful strategy to anchor influence remains controversial, as in many cases it backfired, leading to rejection of the language after decolonization. But since there are some interesting cases that testify to the contrary, even though there are quite a few, when a long-term language policy gave a state a significant foreign policy advantage, and one of them studied in the article is the US promoting English in the Philippines. Another case study in the article is the use of language statecraft as a soft power tool, which relies on the creation of language institutes across the globe. These institutes, as is often asserted, could be seemingly a successful instrument in fixing some of the country's foreign policy image problems, and a good way of increasing its attractiveness, at least in terms of so-called low politics. However, the tangible benefits in many cases do not outweigh the costs, and the article tries to show that in very many cases it's more of a tool which just helps boost self-confidence and self-awareness of the countries initiating the creation of such institutes, but do not actually lead to the attainment of the desired goals. Additionally, any faux pas in these policies may have catastrophic results inverted to those originally conceived of for them, as this can in fact lead to this soft disempowerment of a country, like, for example, China's attempts to ban any discussion of Taiwan, for example, as language institutes in other countries, or other ways in which it's tried to shape the perception of contemporary China through language courses. And these issues and cases are considered in the article alongside other more successful attempts like Alliance Française, a British council, the Goethe Institute, and they're put into both historical and synchronous perspective with the analysis of the balance of pros and cons in each policy choice case. Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Okay, thank you. So our next speaker is Igor Istomin, who is Senior Fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University this year. And he's also Associate Professor at MGIMO. So Igor will tell us about his contribution.
Yes, thank you so much. It's great to be part of this conversation. One just remark that I was last year the fellow at Davis, and it also helped me in producing the result. But unfortunately, the time of the fellowship ran away very fast, and most of it was covered by pandemic. But indeed, it is a great pleasure to be part of this conversation, and it is a great pleasure to be part of the project. My colleagues deal with some very innovative aspects of and instruments of statecraft. Meanwhile, I decided in my paper to go back to the basics, so to say, and discuss military alliances, which is a very traditional instrument of statecraft. But I still believe that there are gaps in examination of the current roles of military alliances, which I tried to capture in my contribution to this special issue. Despite the decrease in number of international conflicts that are kind of identified by the experts, despite the rise of nuclear deterrence, and despite many other shifts in international environment, formal military alliances remain an important element of international landscape. To explain the enduring relevance of military alliances, we need to depart from the traditional and primary role of these institutions as an instrument to accumulate capabilities of several states for the purposes of collective defense, and look also at their other functions. These other functions are especially important for major powers, which trade their security umbrella for influence over the policies of their smaller partners. Thus, the military alliances today in which reinforce and promote hegemonic leadership in asymmetric relations. And obviously, this is a new thought in scholarly literature. Previously examined some of these additional functions concentrated primarily on the relations between the United States and its allies. And this is an obvious focus as Washington maintains an extensive and in many respects unique alliance network. However, my contribution to the volume systematically looked at the Russian record, as Moscow also extended security commitments to a number of countries. Illustratively, it finds it's advisable to maintain formalized alliance relations, at least within the post-Soviet space, despite its negative normative attitude towards military alliances. As many of you probably know, Russia, along with China, criticizes such institutions as an actual threat to international security, viewing them as instruments that reinforce dividing lines and incentivize the security dilemmas. Nevertheless, despite this criticism, Moscow itself does offer formal security guarantees to countries like Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan within the Collective Security Treaty Organization, as well as extended guarantees on bilateral basis to the two entities in the South Caucasus, which it recognizes as independent states. Therefore, in my paper, I sought to draw a certain comparison between the Russian practice in formal alliances with what we know about the United States. And of course, I put primary emphasis on the Russian record as it is less discussed and less developed. However, there are, in my view, some striking similarities between the record of the two major powers, although we cannot avoid major also differences between them. And if we talk about similarities, first of all, we need to understand that both Russia and the United States trade their security guarantees for a selection of benefits rather than just one expected result from all the allies. So military alliances currently appear almost as a Swiss Army knife in statecraft. For example, both states use the leverage that they obtain through alliances to restrict relations between smaller states and their pronounced or envisaged opponents. We can witness this in pressure of Washington on its allies to limit their ties with China. And we could also see very similar or other incentives from Moscow to post-Soviet states to restrict their relations with the EU and NATO. And at the same time, both Moscow and Washington rely on their allies for other purposes, such as power projection, and obtain basing rights on their territory, which is also a major benefit that they extract from their alliances. Also, both Russia and increasingly the US demonstrate caution in extending their formal security commitments to a broader range of states. Russia is especially illustrative in this regard, as it maintains alliances only with the partners in its immediate neighborhood. And in recent years, we see growing security ties between Russia and states beyond its region, in the Middle East and sometimes in Latin America. And often it appears as a security provider for its partners, but it is in no hurry to formalize this status and to formalize such relations. The caution regarding security commitments also appears in the lack of appetite to extend direct military help to the allies in the gray zone, where the extent of such commitments is unclear. I would finally point to one important difference between Russian and US alliances, is that security guarantees from Moscow usually come as a part of a broad institutional package, which also includes integration initiatives, bilateral cooperation programs. And this is somewhat different from how Washington structures its relations with its allies. For example, there is no economic analogy to NATO, while the CSTO membership almost completely mirrors the membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. And I just recently realized that in this respect, there is a certain similarity, and I think our papers talk to each other, between my research and the argument that Adam and Jonathan do in their research on sanctions, that Russia has a rather holistic perspective on statecraft, which presumes pooling various sources of leverage rather than attributing specific effects to specific instruments. And this package approach to ensure Moscow's interests complicates assessment of the contribution of individual tools such as alliances in promoting its interests vis-a-vis partners. But in the paper, I try to overcome these limitations through tracing certain indicative events. So I can speak quite long about the takeaways from the paper, and it is indeed a rather long paper to read, but I'd better stop here as I already have a feeling that I will overstep my time.
Hey, thank you. And finally, among the authors, we will turn to Camilla Pagani, who is Research Fellow at Bocconi University in Milan.
Thank you very much, Professor Hale. Thank you for this invitation. It is an honor to be here at this roundtable with all of you. My article, Migration Statecraft, analyzed the securitization of migration as an instrument of statecraft, which was used in a precise and volatile context, serving different concrete goals, such as the improvement of the terms of trade with Mexico for the United States under Trump administration, strengthening Russia-led economic and political integration projects in post-Soviet Eurasia, obtaining political concession for Turkey from the European Union, especially during the 2016 deal, and finally campaigning in a European election, as it was in the case between Italy and France in 2019. Well, to talk about the takeaways of my article and to update my research on migration statecraft, I will link it to two main current examples, which may epitomize migration statecraft. First of all, in Eastern Europe, with the current crisis at the border between Belarus and Poland, it is an extremely telling case in which the securitization of migration is used as a tool of statecraft with different objectives that is provoking a serious escalation. The framework is very complex as many actors are involved in these tensions. On the one hand, Belarus is trying to put pressure on Poland and the EU in a similar way as Turkey did with the EU during the migrant crisis in 2015 and 2016, and seeking maybe for a similar deal. On the other hand, as an answer to this crisis, the EU member states are about to discuss the possibility of preparing sanctions against Belarus, including sanctions against state-owned airline Belavia, in order to stop the flux of migrants to Belarus. Meanwhile, the securitization of migration at borders is a political opportunity for the Polish party Justice and Liberty, using this crisis for internal political purposes and for negotiating or renegotiating its role within the EU, which is not in a very good, the relationship between Poland within the EU are not in a very good moment. So the stakes are very high on all sides, and it is clear that the securitization of migration has become an ad hoc instrument for negotiations on other fields, economic or political. Secondly, if we take another example, and if we move to the United States at the US-Mexico border, it is useful to analyze the increased role which is played by health-related issues within the context of COVID-19 in migration statecraft processes. I will try to conceive a new concept and as a working concept and call it health statecraft. Health statecraft focuses on the outcomes and the strategies beyond the securitization of health in the process of managing migration at borders. Let me briefly explain it further. The pandemic was an opportunity for many governments to implement strong policies of securitization of health that had as an outcome the strengthening of border controls, from the drastically reduction of the number of border crossing to the closure of borders, and also the track of movement of people. An outstanding case of this is the prolonged use of the Article 42 of the US health law by the Biden administration at the US-Mexico border, despite an explicit change in intentions in migration policies compared to the Trump era. Through Article 42, border officials have the authority to prevent migrants and asylum seekers from entering the US, although there are no clear medical or scientific evidences about this necessity, and COVID-19 vaccinations and tests are now available. So this case shows to what extent the securitization of health played a key role in continuing a strict policy of migration control without overtly showing it. Since statecraft is a toolbox where different means can be used to achieve desired outcomes, the securitization of health permitted to tighten border controls and providing additional leverage to the US with regard to transit and sending states, like, for example, Mexico, Haiti, etc. So I will stop here. It was just to give you a brief overview about the takeaways and the field of applications of migration statecraft. Thank you very much.
Hey, terrific. And now we're very grateful to Michael Reynolds for agreeing to give some comments and thoughts in reaction to the special issue. So we'll give him a little more time if he wants to develop his thoughts. So let's turn things over to Michael, please.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to the sponsors of today's panel, I suppose we call it, discussion. That is International Trends, MGIMO, George Washington, and Ponars. This has been very stimulating for me to read these articles. And let me first just congratulate the editors for coming up with the idea for this special issue. Well, I thought it was both very original to take up the topic of statecraft, and also quite timely. My impression of the study of statecraft is in the US, something that's really, I think it'd be fair to say, is fallen to the wayside, given the way that the study of well, I was about to say, I don't want to say international relations because that always makes people think of the discipline of international relations. And I wouldn't want to say diplomacy because that's something that is subsumed, I think, by statecraft. But what I'm getting at is, I think, the decline of the study of diplomatic history in the United States, which isn't to say there are some very good and important people working with what I would call diplomatic history, but it's definitely not a thriving field in the United States. And the study of statecraft or international relations has been taken over by the discipline of international relations, a subset of political science, both for better and for worse. For the better, because at least somebody is studying it, and for the worse, and I don't mean this to be a dig at political scientists, only that political scientists have specific ways to which they approach these questions. And one of the things I liked about this essay, this issue rather, was that it was looking anew at this question of statecraft and brought to it a wide range of perspectives and sources. I mean, one of the things that really did impress me about all the articles was the breadth and the depth of the sources. I was surprised and pleasantly pleased to see references to literature going back to the 1950s. That is, not because it's from the 1950s, but things that are worthwhile from that to the present day. And what it told me is that all the contributors are very well read. They were not simply looking at the headlines today and then looking at what's been published in the last 2 years or so. And I thought this definitely one of the strengths of the issue as a whole. And I found it quite thought-provoking. One of the key things I think in the introductory essay that I thought was quite important was the point that statecraft has to be understood as not as something static, but as something relational and strategic. That I think is a point that's often overlooked by scholars. I think practitioners know it intuitively, but aren't always so good at explaining it explicitly. It's something that scholars often overlook. This strategic and relational aspect of statecraft. And by strategic, by that I mean the fact that you have two or more actors who are animate and responding to each other. And accordingly, I think, again, the authors made the excellent point that in any analysis of statecraft, one has to be very careful to avoid doing things like mirror imaging. And that, which again, that's a very common mistake in any sort of analysis of strategic interactions, and it's oftentimes a fatal mistake. And the way the authors flag that, and it was, I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. And then the contributors also noted that in a number of their publications. So let me, I think I'm going to try to go by the order that we had Adam Stulberg's article, which I thought was excellent, very thorough, excellent use of data. The data that used, I was very impressed by. It was a wide range of data, both I'll call it, I guess, called big data, statistical data, but then also brought to use specific examples. And I found it very informative. It identified what is quite an important puzzle. Certainly, it's a very important one in actual diplomacy, statecraft, relations between the United States and Russia, as well as it also does pose, I think, a genuine scholarly puzzle. And that is the fact that, as the article points out, really sanctions have had a very limited effectiveness achieving their direct aims. Yet, nonetheless, scholars and experts on all sides treat them as low-cost measures to signal displeasure, coerce, or punish the other in an ongoing struggle. And as the article notes, though, at the end, is that the American expectation, I think it's fair to say the Americans have been, the leaders in this have been very enthusiastic about employing sanctions, yet those sanctions are not delivering the results they're expecting. In fact, arguably, as the article contends, they are generating precisely the opposite effect. And I think this goes to the point that I made just a moment ago about the importance to avoid mirror imagery. And here, I think I'd suggest to Adam, maybe, and this co-author, is that I think one of the key things that's overlooked in the literature on sanctions, and one, though, that they, in their article, highlighted is that, and that's the normative one. And by normative, I mean the way it's received by, or the legitimacy is perceived very differently by both parties. And they, as Adam and this co-author note, Russian discourse, unilateral sanctions opposed by Western rivals lack legitimacy. And that's something I think that advocates for sanctions need to pay a whole lot more attention to. And that is, just one of the points made in the article, but that's one that's stuck with me. Again, that's an article that a lot of people should read, and particularly I hope practitioners will read. Moving then next to Anne's article on language. I thought this was, again, a very stimulating article that used a wide range of historical evidence from German language at the Goethe Institute, the Confucius Institute of China, the British Council of the UK, the Cervantes Institute of Spain, etc., and looked at the use of language in consolidation of nation states, the building of empires, then in post-colonial situations and in current globalization. And the examples, a wide range of examples for the Philippines, Cambodia, France, and others. And it was all, again, I thought quite stimulating. I learned quite a bit in reading it. And one of the things that raised an interest, what I found at the end to be a very interesting puzzle, because the end of the article really emphasizes the benefits that US diplomacy derives from the status of English as a dominant language around the globe. And points out that the article didn't draw this comparison, but I thought it lines up quite well. It's just as the US economy and the US Treasury draw tremendous advantages from the status of the dollar as the predominant global currency, so likewise does the United States draw tremendous advantages from the status of English. In the United States, I don't simply here mean also diplomacy, but things American universities, American businesses, and one could go on, but also including US diplomacy. Yet one thing that struck out the point that came across to me in the article is that this triumph of English is not a product of statecraft. The article, as I mentioned, discusses various states' efforts to promote their languages in order to project a form of soft power and to accrue benefits from that. Yet the United States has not done that, but was able to inherit or not simply inherit, this would be the question, we partially inherited the status of English from the British Empire, but also I think it reflects the strength of the American economy and American military power. And so I wonder what this might say about the future of China and the Chinese language. And it would be interesting to see what impact, if any, the quantity of the Chinese economy and its military might that probably has a diplomatic quality of its own. By that, I don't mean to suggest necessarily that China is going to displace English. There are a lot of good arguments of why it can't do that. But rather, I guess my point is a more broader one, that how important is good statecraft when you have an extremely large economy, a global navy, and a large army for the United States, and that, again, the quantity of your economy and the size of your military may provide a diplomatic quality of their own. Then turning to Igor Istomin's article. Again, here I thought this article really, its range of sources was tremendous. I was very impressed by the depth of research that went in to this article. And I also found it extremely useful as someone looking at how the CSTO operates. So about the first half of the article discussed theories of asymmetric alliances, and then looked in depth at the example of the CSTO and Russia's relations with its alliance partners. And again, I would commend this article to anyone interested in alliance dynamics, and particularly those of asymmetric alliances, but especially those sorts of area experts who are looking to get a better insight into into the CSTO and how Russia understands the CSTO. One of the things I think similar to Adam's point is that this question of sort of normative standpoints and legitimacy. When I oftentimes do read things about Russia's alliances, right in the West, there's always this tinge of sort of, well, there's something illegitimate about these alliances. There's something either exploitative about them, something underhanded about them, something that we should all be quite suspicious about. And for those who are quite familiar with that literature, I'd suggest reading this article, which I think makes a pretty compelling case for let me say, for lack of a better word, the rational benefits that both Russia and its alliance partners derive from these relationships. And I think it does an important job at demystifying some of those dynamics. Lastly, I think this is the last one then, is Camilla's article on migration. And boy, talk about one that is very timely right now, is the different crises unfolding on the borders between Belarus and Poland. And as someone who also, some of you know, I'm also work on Turkey. And I was just noticing now today that Turkey has been roped into this crisis as well, because apparently a lot of the migrants who are going into Belarus and then trying to get into Poland are coming into Belarus via Turkey. And some people are accusing now the Turks of having an underhanded role in that, which may or may not be the case. I suspect maybe simply that people are buying airline tickets and flying through Turkey. But nonetheless, as Camilla noted in their article, however, one of her key case studies was Turkey in the EU, and how Turkey has, frankly, quite skillfully used the threat of migrants against the EU to sort of bully it and browbeat it and get what it wants. And I thought Camilla did a very good job in selecting her cases. She had the range, the US and Mexico, which for any American is always a very timely case study. Turkey and the EU, which is just mentioned, has been, I'm sitting here in Moscow, so this is a bit closer to the geography here, a bit closer to home, so to speak, if I could say right now, if I could use that expression, home for Moscow. And as I just mentioned, and as Camilla mentioned at the beginning, you also have now this crisis unfolding in Belarus. And then the example of France and Italy as well, which I thought, bringing in that case study of two Western European countries who have had spats with each other over migrants. I guess I would just throw out one thought that came to my mind is that Camilla cited a lot of the literature which emphasizes how migration undermines states, it weakens them, and there's often sort of the takeaway that one gets from reading much of this literature, sort of, well, the nation state is doomed. The migration is unstoppable and is going to sweep them away, and this will be the end of states. But there's another way to look at this, which is that, to the contrary, actually, migration is provoking states to respond to it and is revitalizing states. And let me just, I won't go on too much longer. I'll just conclude with this. One example of this would be Hungary, which is a state that has distinguished itself by its migration policies, distinguished itself from the EU. And who would have guessed that's, let's say, I don't know, let's go 20 or 25 years ago, that it would be audiences in the United States looking at Hungary and debating, does Hungary have something to teach us, as opposed to Hungarians looking at the United States. And as we see the migration, the way it's already changed, the challenges have changed politics inside of Europe, inside of the United States and elsewhere, I think the assumption of much of the literature that migration portends the obsolescence of the nation state is not even half, well, let's say it's half right, meaning that it's half wrong. And I think that that's the case for some states, but for many others, it actually might be the thing that is going to, that has provoked the revitalization and very well might provoke it both for better and very quite possibly for worse. So let me conclude with those thoughts. And again, thank all of the authors for an issue that I really did find very stimulating, and I would recommend anyone listening in who hasn't looked at the issue to do it. It's an original and very well put together publication. Thank you. Okay,
thank you for the terrific comments. So now we can move beyond the program to discussion with others here. And we actually asked if Sam Charap would be willing to say a few words. He's senior political scientist at RAND. And he's co-author of a recent RAND study of Russian strategy, and I think he's familiar with the special issue. So maybe, Sam, do you want to say a few words, and then we can open it up. I see we have some questions coming in.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks to the authors for the opportunity to contribute. I think I'm unfortunately not quite in as privileged a position as Mike, as having had the opportunity to fully dive into the special issue, as I only realized that I would be free at this time a couple days ago. But I listened attentively this morning, and I've had the opportunity to at least begin to get into the issue itself. And I just wanted to make 3 quick points, nothing anywhere near as comprehensive as Mike's comments. The first is on the utility of the term, and particularly of the definition and the way it's developed in the piece, in light of the recent, now it's supposed to 7 years really of use and abuse of the term hybrid in policy discussions and beyond, particularly hybrid war, hybrid warfare, hybrid tactics, and so on. I should note that this is not just an academic debate or debate among people using the term. There are, divisions of governments and international organizations devoted to hybrid threats now. And really, when it comes down to it, the definition that is provided here for statecraft is not only much more precise, but also incorporates the key, sort of issue that the term hybrid was getting at, which is essentially that, states have resorted to more coercive actions, short of the use of force or short of the use of brute force, in recent years, particularly major powers, to affect the calculus or behavior of other states in a way that is that has coercive elements, but isn't about tanks on a battlefield trying to destroy other tanks. And I think if we return the discussion to one about statecraft, we get out of the sort of essentialization in a way of tactics that, although perhaps unpleasant, that have been put under the banner of hybrid, are in fact quite common in the history of international politics, and are quite consistent with a broader understanding of statecraft. That doesn't make them necessarily just or welcome, but at least they are. They should be thought of as, certainly not something that is novel or different. And that's what I think, the term and the use of it in the issue is a quite useful corrective. And essentially the only time the word hybrid appears in the entire issue is either in a reference or in the body of the text in reference to perceptions. So I applaud them for that. And one other element of statecraft, which I think comes through, but perhaps might be usefully more highlighted, is that it's not just that statecraft is about trying to influence other actors short of the use of force, or it's also about, avoiding coercion without a plausible policy objective. And I think this gets to Adams' and his co-author's analysis of sanctions. In other words, coercion for punishment's sake is not really statecraft when it comes down to it, because you're not really actually trying to affect the behavior of another state. You're just trying to inflict pain. And so statecraft sort of usefully, I think, pushes the policy discussion back to one of how states should be thinking about actually affecting the behavior of other states, as opposed to this idea of punishment, which does seem to be like the non-kinetic brute force in a way, which is sort of beyond the scope of statecraft. And finally, one thing I'd just like to ask perhaps our Russian authors to reflect on, a little bit, is the caveat and the footnote about the lack of a Russian translation of the term. And I wonder if that reflects the sort of elasticity of the term in English, the fact that it has become so, that it means so many different things to different people, or something deeper perhaps about differences in, political cultures or something, or whether it's just the fact that some words aren't translatable, or concepts, that is, and don't have a single word. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, great, thank you. So there's a question from the floor that raises the question of changes in statecraft that might or might not come from changes in administration or the leadership of the country. And actually that kind of resonates with the question I wanted to pose to the panel, which was, you know, we now have close to a year of Biden's own statecraft, or his kind of practice of it in the United States. So that raised the question to me of like, what do the authors think based on their research are, you know, prospects for at least like the next 3 years in U.S.-Russian relations. I mean, I've seen, you know, there are reports that there may be a summit sometime in the next few months. You know, should we expect anything of substance coming out of that based on people's research and your general thinking? A lot of great experts on Russian-U.S. relations here. And then the question from the floor, though, focuses on the Russian side, which is, of course, changes in administration there, far less frequent historically, and certainly recently you haven't had one for quite a while. So the question is, how much change in Russian statecraft should we expect whenever that transition occurs? So, I mean, maybe unless there are any other, I don't see other questions here right now. So maybe what we could do, since I think there's a lot that's already been put out there by Michael and Sam, maybe let's turn it back to the editors and authors, and Andrey, if he wants to as well, weigh in just on any of these issues that were raised. But I'd ask you to keep your comments brief so that we hopefully have some time at the very end for a little follow-up if we need to. So maybe if you could keep your remarks to just you know, a couple minutes, that would be great. So maybe we could just go in the reverse order with which we started, if that's okay. So maybe start with Camilla, if there's anything you want to respond to the questions or to the comments made by anyone so far. And then we'll go back in the reverse order. So Camilla, Igor, then I guess Adam, Mikhail, Jenna, and then Andrey. So Camilla.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I would just, as I took the example of the securitization of health at the US-Mexico border, I would just add that, frankly speaking, there was not a very substantial change with regard to migration, the securitization of migration at the border. And this was thanks to the use of Article 42 of the US health law, which permitted to continue the same system of preventing asylum seekers and migrants from accessing the United States, although not showing it overtly. So the political rhetoric changed a lot, but in some substantially with regard to this particular situation, there were not so many changes. But again, I think it is too early to assess the Biden administration with regard to migration. We need to wait and see for the future. This was just about this particular point. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, Igor, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank our great commentators for taking the time to read the special issue and for their very useful remarks. And I just wanted to say that the question that was posed by Sam is something that I was struggling with. And I have to say that I'm still struggling, even despite part of the special issue, with the notion of statecraft and what it really means and how we could explain it. And this is also because I think it's not very easy to adequately translate into Russian. I think the word that Sam used about elasticity of the term indeed is true, because we could easily translate into Russian all the different meanings of statecraft that are in the English language. but we will just need every time a different term and different concept. And this kind of, I think just the language is created in a different way, but I'm not sure that this reflects some kind of social and political kind of differences. The one thing which I identified and first thought about when I was reading Adam and Johnson's article, and then I also remembered some previous literature that I have read, for example, Dima Adamski's book on the military innovation. And I was thinking that there is some indeed difference between this synthetic type of thinking and analytical type of thinking, the one which tries to kind of define different parts and think about different instruments and try to kind of trace this cause-effect relations between different instruments and the results, and then more holistic approach, which tries to think about kind of the situation in general, and is not necessarily interested how much weight is this part of my action do on the result, and how much effect has that my actions on the eventual result, but views as a kind of an overall kind of theme which produces the result in its complexity and its overallness. So I think this could be perhaps one of the reasons of that. And then if it's true, if it's kind of type of thinking, then I think the changes in the kind of specific personalities and political leadership will certainly affect some aspects of the Russian foreign policy, but will not affect this type of perception of the world and perception of how we could interact with the world. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So next we have Adam.
So let me just tick off a few things. One, on the issue of statecraft, I just want to commend everybody for their comments on it, but my perspective on it and why we use this term, at least why I was gravitating towards it, is that it would encompass the relational and dynamic elements that Michael mentioned, but also would put a focus on strategy, choices, and trade-offs, which I think is very important for for everybody to understand, because a lot of attention has been put on specific instruments or goals or even outcomes, but the ways, the strategies, and what goes into the strategies, how they're conceived of, that I think can also help not only to appreciate those differences that can lead to hopefully more empathy and understanding about how different parties approach a problem. So that was sort of why, one of the reasons why I also think statecraft is a compelling rallying or unifying theme. Two, on the issue of whether, the question from the field about whether or not this is Putin-centric. And my research, at least on the sanctions stuff, which is not so much highlighted in this one article, suggests that a lot of these trends predated Putin and have to do with a broader understanding of the role of sanctions across the Soviet and Russian strategic community. That said, there are some more temporal issues, such as this more recent twist in the thinking and definition of warfare that may not be confined to violent means, that may be more of a contemporary adaptation of it. But because it really is resonating with such a broader segment of analysts and strategists, it's not, again, I don't think this is Putin-centric. I think this is reflective of a very different way of thinking about sanctions that will extend beyond Putin. The last point I want to make in terms of Henry's question about my advice to or my expectation of the Biden administration is, I think they are continuing this view about sanctions and looking at it in a vacuum and not fully understanding how the other side, or in this case, Russia, understands sanctions. And so my recommendation would be for this resumption of a dialogue is to get back to basics and really focus on understanding what the other strategy is in this context, and maybe having a discourse on pathways to escalation in this sort of non-kinetic long-term competition space. Because I think one of the real concerns when they talk about strategic stability is that I think, again, just like with sanctions, there are very different understandings of that. And I think Igor and Mikhail touched on that. And to begin to think you're going to be able to reach an agreement without understanding what the strategy is or where the potential areas of difference and risk of escalation are, I think is going to be problematic. So I would recommend going back to basics, not mirror imaging on these issues, and sort of deconstruct them along the lines that many of the authors in this volume have begun doing.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Next we have Mikhail and then Jenna.
Yeah, thank you, Henry, and thank you, Michael and Sam, for your insightful remarks. So I'll be brief. I think Biden statecraft prospects. Well, that's a very broad theme indeed. But if we discuss it vis-a-vis Russia and Eurasia, I think it's a very interesting case of statecraft preferences being sort of manifested already at this stage, while the goals have not yet come out and have not yet been openly sort of announced. And yet we can sort of define the broad contours of Biden's statecraft. And I think these are first risk avoidance. Then it is also kind of ticking the box of having kind of talked to the counterpart, having discussed, at least, having conducted a discussion of any outstanding issues. And generally, I think it is also about working behind the scenes and not rushing to make the administration's goals clear, because apparently there's belief that there's nothing to be gained from just again, as I try to convey in my message, in defining clear-cut interests and goals, because you are going to get flack from basically everyone, and you'll become very vulnerable. So I think Biden is trying to avoid exactly that. But that said, his statecraft is, I think, already clear enough. And now, secondly, change of change of administration in the Russian and US case, whether that's going to affect statecraft, I think, yes, significantly. I normally don't buy the notion of eternal interest, but the elegance of the notion of statecraft, and this is one reason why we took it up for this issue, for this special issue, is that it kind of allows to discuss the impact of conduct of the way foreign policy is implemented, and it allows to see the nonlinear way of action and reaction that you get when using specific means of statecraft. So the impact is nonlinear. The impact of a particular technique, of a particular choice, of a combination of instruments, and this is what statecraft is for me, that can actually sort of breed very unexpected reactions, very nonlinear, and then the reaction of the first party is gonna also be nonlinear, and then we get very, very far immediately from where we were. And that is something that I think is captured by the notion of statecraft. So for sure, any new administration, wherever it is, Russia, the United States, will certainly change statecraft, and even a small adjustment is going to have major ripple effects for the relationship, and certainly more broadly. I mean, you just start bringing in refugees to the border of Belarus and Poland, and you have a completely new situation, and we don't know where it actually goes from there. But the disturbance was very, very small. And finally, yeah, it's a difficult one to answer why the term statecraft hasn't been so much sort of discussed and developed in the Russian discourse. I believe that is because, you know, in Russia, there's been little discussion of foreign policy as a process, really, as a process and a model that I just tried to describe, whereby methods really matter. And not just specific instruments, whether it's, you know, sort of public diplomacy or use of military force or economic sanctions, but the broader pattern, the way you treat the outside world, how much it matters. And I think the belief in Russia has been that it really doesn't matter that much. You know, everyone will still do the same, more or less, whether we you know, approach them this or that way. Responses to instruments matter, but it's about, you know, what you expect if you use force or what you expect if you use sanctions, but not the broader sort of pattern of behavior. That's why I think the Russian discourse has so far lacked, you know, a comprehensive term that would describe this pattern of behavior. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. And so Jenna, I think you have 3 or 4 minutes if you want it.
I will be very quick. Thank you all for your comments. It was, thank you, Michael, for and Samuel for the comments. They were really, really helpful. And I like how you pulled it all together. And I actually just wanted to make one comment. You know, I've spent a lot of my time, my career studying counterterrorism and non-state actors. And so Samuel made a very interesting comment about statecraft not being punishment. And I thought that was very interesting from my perspective as someone that studies counterterrorism policy and non-state actors. And it's, I don't know, it's something I have to reflect on more and whether that applies in the kind of non-state state dynamic as well. I think it's something to think about. But you know, the more I actually like read about statecraft, I feel like the less I actually understand the concept, because it's so as I got into this project, I thought, oh, okay, I know what statecraft is. And the more I read and the more I think about it, the more nuanced I think the concept is. And so I love all of the presentations today and how everyone came at it from a really different way and looked at the instruments in a really meaningful way. So I got a lot out of working on this issue. So thank you. But I just wanted, my comment I wanted to make was on something that Michael had said about the idea of statecraft being relational. And I think that's exactly right. And that was really, I think, what motivated a lot of our thinking about this initially. And I think if we, you know, think about that idea of it being relational, it can provide maybe a little bit of an understanding to the question about the change in administrations. You know, I mean, I think that this idea of relational brings up the idea of thinking about the nature of the relationship between the actors themselves, right? And it's that kind of empathetic dimension that Adam mentioned in his comments, the idea that, you know, we have to each understand not just each other, but what the other thinks about us, what we think they think about us, right? That really truly relational dimension is so critical. And so then thinking about this sort of change of administrations, and that's something, you know, whenever I teach grand strategy, I always think, have we really seen much shift in grand strategy across administrations, you know, at least in the US, right? We can find little subtle differences, but overall, is there a shift? And I think that idea of thinking about changes in grand strategy can be instructive for thinking about changes in statecraft over time as well, and whether we actually see that. And so maybe the change is really a function of the change in the nature of the relationship itself. And, you know, thinking about Igor's comments, I kept thinking about this all along when he was talking about the, you know, this sort of alliance dynamics. And if those, you know, alliances or the nature of them or the meaning of them change, then maybe we do see a change in statecraft from that kind of, you know, relational dimension. So I guess the answer is, I'm not sure if we are going to see a significant change in statecraft across administrations, at least from the US perspective. I think there's sort of, you know, minor shifts in instruments, but the overall strategic orientation, I think, really is a function of the nature of that relationship. And until those relationships change, I don't think we will see much change. So, anyways, that was all I had to say. So thank you all. This was really fun.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, that brings us almost exactly to the end of our allotted time. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot that we could discuss here, but I want to thank all the speakers, the contributors to the special issue, Michael and Sam for offering your comments. I think this is a fascinating discussion. I encourage everybody to take a look at the journal, and I think it will provide a lot of a stimulus for a lot of future thinking on these and important other related issues. So thank you once again, and we'll look forward to the next time we can all get together.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry.